Recording is on.
All right. So welcome everybody to this meeting of the Ossipee Aquifer Advisory Committee. The OAAC has been around for a number of years and there's a lot of familiar faces here tonight. This committee is open to the public, so please feel free to share this recording once we send it out with the minutes after the meeting with others in your town that might be concerned about drinking water and drinking water protection in our area. We all share this incredibly important resource. It's critical for all of us and our quality of life. And we all need to get behind protecting it. Because pollution in one town can affect pollution and the water quality in other towns as well. So tonight we have just a brief overview that I'm going to run through with the history and the mission of the OAAC. And then looking ahead to 2020 and 2021, given our odd situation right now, it's a little difficult to do a lot of programs that we had initially planned with the public, but we'll try and do it through Zoom and other means. And when things are a little safer, we'll get out there and do some of these hands-on public programs that we had initially planned. So Bob, if you want to put my PowerPoint up, we'll get right into it.
How's that?
Great. All right, so the Ossipee Aquifer Advisory Committee, or the OAAC, began a number of years back, and it's been called different things along the way. It's worked on many different projects concerning drinking water protection and the Ossipee Aquifer. And Green Mountain Conservation Group, which is the organization that I work for as the education coordinator, was responsible for starting this committee, made up of citizens and different individuals, you know, professionals like Dr. Newton, who are concerned about drinking water quality where we live. And originally this was started through a grant from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the mission and objectives that the committee has created along the way are to raise public awareness and assist communities with regional aquifer protection, to work in an advisory capacity with local municipalities, agencies, boards, and commissions within our watershed, to educate the public and to assist in awareness about the Ossipee Aquifer, and to review, gather data, and communicate any potential impact on the Ossipee Aquifer from development. And jot this down, if you would. The next meeting that we have is Wednesday, September 30th from 5 to 6 p.m. Okay, next slide. So the Ossipee Aquifer, if you're unfamiliar, if you look at this slide and the map on the slide, the light blue area and the darker blue overlay of surface waters, the light blue area, thanks Bob, is the aquifer. So incredibly large aquifer, largest one in the state of New Hampshire, connecting all of these towns and supplying a lot of these towns with their drinking water resource. Made up of layers of sand and gravel that were deposited by glaciers. It's very quickly recharged with rainwater and snowmelt, and very easily contaminated. So water moves through it fairly quickly. And like I said, extremely important drinking water resource. You'll see in the next few slides just how many folks in this area rely on that aquifer for their drinking water. All right, next slide. Okay, so 14 communities in New Hampshire are within our watershed, and all of our water resources, surface waters, groundwater, is connected. So we all depend on this aquifer in one way, shape, or form. About 71% of the folks in these communities have private wells, or 23,800. And 29% rely on public water systems, also, you know, dipping into that aquifer. And as you know, this time of year, those numbers shoot way up. This year, we'll see what happens, but usually with tourists and summer residents, we get a lot more folks relying on the aquifer for their drinking water. While public water systems are monitored or regulated by the state. Private wells are not. So it's up to the individual homeowner to make sure their water is safe. All right, next slide. And drinking water protection at the local level, municipalities are empowered to protect their water supplies through a number of different RSAs listed here on this slide. And in fact, many New Hampshire communities have adopted groundwater protection ordinances or other measures to ensure that their drinking water is protected above and beyond what the state can do. So this was put up, this information is from back in November of 2018, so that number may have changed of 103 New Hampshire communities adopting groundwater protection ordinances. It likely has. And 8 of the 14 aquifer communities in the Ossipee Watershed have an ordinance. And Bob, if you hit enter, I think there'll be another image that crops up here. Yes. Okay, so there's our Ossipee Watershed towns that share this aquifer, and you can see the ones in light blue are ones that do not currently have an ordinance, and the ones in the pinkish red are ones that do. Although Albany is currently working on a groundwater protection ordinance at this time. Okay, next slide. So how can you help? You can join this group or keep in touch with this committee and, you know, be the eyes and ears. This committee has been incredibly important and critical, I'd say, in detecting potential threats to our drinking water and issues in our various watershed communities, and working through those issues in a way that you know, is collaborative, includes all stakeholders, and also has been successful at preventing significant threats to the aquifer. So you all are the eyes and ears of your town. Oftentimes we don't find out about these issues until somebody brings them to our attention. So we collaborate with stakeholders through this committee to ensure that protection measures are in place. So working within your town to make sure you have a groundwater protection ordinance, an overlay district, certain sensitive areas of land or critical areas of land contributing to drinking water are protected. Groundwater reclassification is another option for additional protection layers, and making sure that best management practices are being followed by area, you know, homeowners and businesses. And then assisting with education and outreach. You can also make sure that you test your own well every 3 to 5 years. This is a recommendation by the state. And Green Mountain Conservation Group, and my primary responsibility as an educator, brings a number of different water education programs to communities. One of them is Get Wet, and we have a training for that in January, hopefully, of 2021. All right, next slide. And as the eyes and ears of the aquifer, of the watershed, one of the things that I check into fairly often whenever there's an issue is this portal called the New Hampshire DES OneStop data site. And I think it's really critical. We don't get noticed in the mail about a lot of the development that is happening on the ground in our towns sometimes. So checking into this and seeing what's going on, I think is pretty crucial. So you kind of have to be your own guardian in your town of your water supply here and do your own detective work. But if you go into this portal, a lot of this information that we're talking about is public. So you can look at what the water testing results are for a public water system. You can look at solid waste facilities and landfills and see what's going on with their water. You can see when there's permits applied for groundwater discharge and all that sort of stuff. Next slide. And you can look by town and look by public water system, and it'll pull up everything in your town that's a hazardous waste site. It'll pull up every public water system in your town. And you can check out what's going on and see if something's, you know, coming up down the pike, and let this committee know about it so that we can take proactive measures to prevent, contamination events. Next slide. All right, so in 2020, 2021, Green Mountain Conservation Group is fortunate to have received some funding from the Tamworth Foundation, and we anticipate doing a lot of programs for Get Wet in Tamworth, and with Dr. Newton, some groundwater study presentations. We're also creating some remote learning drinking water protection videos on our new YouTube channel. So those will be widely available. The Get Wet trainings are in January, as I mentioned, and that's for anyone who's interested in helping in local schools. We test, the kids take water bottles home and they test their drinking water for various parameters in the classroom and learn all about groundwater and water quality. All right, next slide. Okay, and as Andrew Madison from the Source Water Protection Program at DES has said, education and outreach as a tool are one of our best defenses against contamination. I really truly believe that that is the case. Once people know about the source of their drinking water and what it is that they need to do to make sure it's safe, and how it's all connected, I think they're more apt to protect it. So I wanted to give a couple of updates real quick before Bob starts on a few of the issues that we had been working on through this committee last year. And the first one is the PFAS, per polyfluoroalkyl substances monitoring in Effingham and Tamworth. And so many of you might be aware from our PFAS workshop last November with Brandon Kernan from New Hampshire DES and Shayna Casper from Toxics Action Center that Effingham and Tamworth landfills both came back with elevated PFAS in their monitoring wells for the closed landfills. And as a result, some receptor surveys were done and private residents were contacted to have their wells tested. And to date, all of those tests came back no detect for PFAS, for the 9 PFAS that are standard for testing. And so that's good news. Other good news is that the state has reached out to a couple of other homeowners and schools that are close by these wells to make sure that they get tested as well. So that's all good. The plan for the future for those is that the wells will be tested annually, and then the residents that are within the 500 feet of those wells will be tested every 5 years. And if the wells show increasing trends, then the testing would be more frequently. Okay. The other update on the PFAS is the legislation. The legislation has been a mess for the state. There was a court case brought by 3M, the company there in southern New Hampshire, versus New Hampshire DES's recommended lowering of the PFAS standards. It's in the Supreme Court right now, this court case, and there's no telling when the court will hear the matter. However, there's legislation SB 287 that passed the Senate and will soon be discussed by the House. And this legislation would put the MCL into law such that the litigation about the New Hampshire DES rulemaking would no longer be a barrier to implementing the MCLs. So right now, the old standards of 70 parts per trillion still apply for PFAS. The new level is 12, different levels for different chemicals, but 12, I think, is what generally is referred to as the newer standard. And when and if that is adopted, many sites will probably need retesting and new testing and mitigation. So we'll keep folks abreast of that issue. I have some links that I'll share in the minutes for that situation. And then Pinetree Power, the update here really quickly is that, so August 26, 2019, Pinetree Power submitted their request to withdraw their permit, which the permit they submitted on June 26, 2019 to discharge up to 100,000 gallons of wastewater a day into the aquifer. After that point, DES had said they needed to submit a schedule for monitoring well decommissioning and site reclamation work. Nothing has been submitted to date. Mitch Locker from DES says no further information or reports at this point to share. So this is, we're assuming the state's responsibility to follow up with them on that. And maybe some folks here have a better pulse on what's going on at the power plant at this time, but that's where that situation is right now. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Bob, so you can start your presentation.
Well, thanks, Tara. Let me just take a second here and bring up. Oh dear. Let me take 2 seconds. That's what I did wrong. Right. So let's see. I'll go here. So I thought I was being smart and prepared, but that's what happens when you just try to be smart and prepared.
Just a reminder, I don't know if people can hear me right now.
Yes, but, they can.
They can, okay. If you have any questions or comments that you want to address towards the end of the meeting tonight, just add those in the chat option, which is at the bottom middle of your screen. You can type in your chat, everyone will see it, and we can have a record of it in case we don't get to everybody's questions or address everyone's concerns. We can get to that later as well.
Okay, so let me get started since I have a lot to say and I don't want to take too much time. So Tara sort of reported on the Pinetree power situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about Pinetree power because I think it's a good example of the vulnerability of the Ossipee Aquifer to contamination and how easily contaminated it can be, and maybe the state isn't able to protect it as well as we would hope that they would. And so one of the questions that we need to address when we talk about Pinetree power is what constitutes safe drinking water? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in context of Pinetree power. So let's go a little bit of history here. Pinetree power was built in 1987. It's a 25 megawatt system generating electricity. It uses wood chips as the source, and it generates about 4,000 tons of ash per year. And in the past, for most of its operation, the wastewater that was produced and the chemicals were removed from the wastewater stream and mixed with the ash, and that material was disposed of at various sites, a number of agricultural sites, as it was felt to have some benefit to the soil. So that was how it was done for most of the plant's operation. So, and then the other thing to keep in mind is that it uses a tremendous amount of groundwater. So 300,000 gallons per day is the amount that's used on a regular basis. So as Tara said a little bit about what happened, so the Pinetree power and other wood chip plants in New Hampshire are not very competitive. The costs of operating are too high, and so they have difficulty making money. So in 2018, the New Hampshire Senate passed a bill that would grant subsidies to the biomass power plants. The bill was passed, but it was vetoed by the governor. The legislature overrode the veto, but eventually the Public Utility Commission said that the way in which the subsidies were being given out was not legal. So then in the spring of 2019, another bill was passed using another method for giving the subsidies to the power plants. And again, that bill passed and was vetoed by the governor. And then last fall, the legislature's override attempt failed. And so there was no, there's been no help for subsidies to the biomass plant. So let's talk a little bit about what happened at Pinetree Power and why, maybe not why, but what they intend, how they wanted to change their operations. And the key thing to understand about it is that they generate a lot of wastewater, and it's coming from their cooling tower. And the cooling tower water is coming from the groundwater. So they're taking the groundwater, they're using it as cooling tower water to cool the water in the system, condense the steam back to water, and then that water is getting contaminated. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's a lot of water used in the system. They're cycling water rate of about 26,000 gallons per minute, or 37 million gallons per day. So how does this system work? So here's a little bit of a story on how it all works. So you have over in the right side, you might be able to see my cursor here. You have the boiler, and where water is turned to steam, passes through the turbine, generates electricity, and then the spent steam, the low pressure steam, is brought back down and recondensed to water, and then pumped back into the boiler, and the system is running like that. So it's a closed system. This part of the system, the boiler, the turbine, water moving through that part of the system, is a closed system. The source of the contaminant water, the wastewater, is coming from the cooling system. And so you're taking groundwater, and you're essentially taking that groundwater and you're passing it through this condenser that will condense the steam back to water. So it's like your hot water heater, in the sense that there's maybe my hot water heater, where I take hot water in pipes and use it to heat the hot water in the house. So it's a closed system like that. So they're taking the cold groundwater and they're using it to condense the steam. And then that groundwater, which is now warm, is brought up to the cooling tower, and it's sprayed down through the cooling tower, where that water is cooled further. And the primary way of cooling is through evaporation. So there's a fan and air is blown up through it, water sprayed down, and then the cool water that didn't evaporate, it comes down to the bottom and then goes back through the system. So there are two problems with this for the system. And one is that, well, you're evaporating lots of water. So the concentration of dissolved constituents in the water, in the cooling water system, gets to get very high. So they don't want any of those condensate, any of this water to precipitate any of the things in the water. So they add things like sulfuric acid. And so they add sulfuric acid to keep the minerals in solution. And the other problem is that, well, you're spraying warm water down through this open tower. And of course, that's a great place for slime to grow, algae and slime. And so they want to prevent the clogging of the system with all the algae and slime. And so they add things like bleach. So sodium hypochlorite is what bleach is. And so that's added to prevent slime. So they're adding those two things to the water, and the water's going through there, it's being evaporated, and so the water level's going down. So every once in a while they have to add makeup water, but they probably add it pretty much continuously. New groundwater coming in, and they add it to the system, and it goes around and around. And eventually, of course, the concentrations within the water get way too high. And so they have to flush out all that dissolved constituents, and that's what's called the blowdown water, and that's the wastewater. Okay, so that's where how the wastewater is generated. So what they wanted to do, and I won't put words into their mouth to say why they were doing this, but they wanted to find another way to dispose of the wastewater, the blowdown water. So in December of 2018, they applied for a permit to dispose of 100,000 gallons of wastewater per day on site using rapid infiltration basins. Well, the thing about our aquifer is that it's highly permeable and the soils are highly permeable. So it's a great place to use rapid infiltration basins. If you pour the water on the ground, it will disappear. And that was sort of their philosophy. And in fact, the state said, well, that's a good idea because you'll actually be recharging the groundwater. And that's certainly true, although the chemistry of that water is quite a bit different from the water that started out. So a temporary permit was granted in January of 2019. And this is the infiltration basins as they have used them. And so you can see they've just dug some shallow basins here with a bucket loader. And of course, it's all sand and easily dug, and you can get down there really fast, and you get to this really nice sand that's going to infiltrate the water really easily. So that's their idea. Pour the wastewater into there, and it will disappear underground and recharge the groundwater. So where is this happening? So here is a digital elevation model of the area with Silver Lake here, Ossipee Lake here, the Bear Camp River, the Shikarawa River, and these infiltration basins, and what I used was the monitoring wells they put in here as the location of the infiltration basin. So they're located right here next to the Shikarawa River. And if we were to look on this map, that would be located right about over here. And it's in this area that's mapped in yellow. And all these bright colors, the non-greens, represent areas where the aquifer is exposed at the surface. They're highly permeable sands and gravels. And so this is the aquifer. If you look at the digital elevation model and sort of come in, zoom in, and I love to do this because, you know, this is using new LiDAR data in which you get elevations, precise elevations of the land surface about every, in New Hampshire, it's about every 2.8 feet on the surface of the ground. You get a precise elevation. And we use these to generate these models of what the landscape looks like. And you can see the actual meltwater stream channels that flowed across this outwash plain. These are the glacial meltwater stream channels when the ice was sitting over here in Silver Lake. And the meltwater is coming off that ice and running out here. So this is you know, just the most beautiful outwash sands and gravels, highest permeability, greatest aquifer you could ever ask for. You go out in the landscape, this was a photo taken a number of years ago, but nevertheless, we can see the very flat surface of the outwash plain and the sands and gravels that are exposed. This is a little bit closer to where Pinetree Power is now located. And you can see it's wonderful sand all through here. So perfectly flat, well, it's got a little slope to it, but it is the outwash plain from the glacier. Now, in 1995, the US Geological Survey did a study of the groundwater resources in this area. So this report by Moore and Medali in 1995 laid out the aquifer and did some modeling to show how much water was in and moving through the aquifer and how much water was available in the aquifer. And this represents one of the largest stratified or superficial stratified drift aquifers in the state of New Hampshire. A really incredible aquifer as they had defined it. Now here is that same aquifer. I've used different colors here to show how much groundwater is available in each place and what the yield would be. And so the reds are higher yielding than the yellows. But you can see, here's their infiltration basin located right in the heart of the aquifer. And by the way, it's also located very close to the boundaries of 4 different towns. So it could potentially influence not just one town, but many towns: Tamworth, Madison, Freedom, and Ossipee. So they proposed to do this, and so they were granted a temporary permit to test out these rapid infiltration basins, and they did 2 experiments. The first experiment was done in January of 2019. And their proposal, of course, is to dispose of 100,000 gallons of waste per day. So they did this over a fairly short period of time. The January experiment, in which they put in about 400,000 gallons in January, and then they did a later experiment in April, in which they put in another 600,000. So the total was 1 million gallons of wastewater was infiltrated into this particular basin here. And you can see the sand's all messed up, and also a lot of things are growing in it because there's a lot of nutrients in that water as well. So what about the water chemistry of the blowdown water, the wastewater? And how does that compare with what the water quality standards are? So for arsenic, the standard is 10. It's about to be 5. It might be 5 now. New Hampshire's about to be 5 parts per billion. And blowdown water had 40 parts per billion. So that was above. Calcium, there's no standard. 660 was what it was. Magnesium, no standard. And you go through here and you see a lot of things have no standards. And the things I want to pay attention to are sodium, where there's no standard. But the amount of sodium that was in the blowdown water was 8,900 milligrams per liter. Of course, that's not a big surprise. They were using bleach, which is sodium hypochlorite. So sodium, we would expect in the waste stream, because they were putting it into the water. And then chloride, where there's no standard, was 9,300 milligrams per liter. And again, chloride's not a surprise because they were using bleach, sodium hypochlorite, and it oxidizes to chloride, and that's how it destroys the organic material. And things like sulfate, there's a standard of 500, but there's 6,000 in the water. And then I put in specific conductance. It's specific electrical conductance, and it's a really good measure of the overall concentrations of dissolved constituents in the water. And there's no standard for it, but I would just point out that the amount of specific conductance in the wastewater was 47,000 microsiemens per centimeter. You don't need to worry about that. It's a measure of conductance, electrical conductance, which is the inverse of ohm, the resistance. And the pH was about 7.9. Okay, so how does that compare with the ambient groundwater? Now, we have, in previous surveys, we've done analysis of 7 wells in this part of the aquifer. And if we look at the concentration in the average of those 7 wells in this part of the aquifer, we see that the average for the ambient background groundwater in the wells we've looked at is, well, sodium's about 5, chloride's about 4, sulfate's about 4, specific conductance is 79. The blowdown water, circulation water that they sampled on this date had a concentration of sodium 8,900, chloride 9,200, sulfate 6,000. Notice these are all unregulated, so it's okay if you drink that according to the state, with that specific conductance of 47,000. Now, what they did was, because of the arsenic situation, they tried to dilute it. So in the January experiment, they took some background groundwater and they mixed it 1 part of this ambient water, of the circulation water, to 3 parts of the pure groundwater, which we can assume is that ambient water. And they brought the concentrations down to these values. And then they did really not very much monitoring of their monitoring wells, but here's one on in the May, this was in May, 290 milligrams per liter sodium. So we can sort of see that this is really different. The water the water they're putting into the ground is totally different from the water they're taking out. And so here's a little bar chart to demonstrate this. Here's the ambient groundwater, and these are at the same scale. So, you don't see anything in the ambient groundwater because concentrations are so low. And this is the diluted water that they're infiltrating into the aquifer, and you can see it's very highly concentrated. And then I have this non-potable potable diagram, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the World Health Organization would say that this water is far above any potable or drinking water standard based on these things. So the question is, well, what is drinkable water? And there are no regulations against sodium and chloride, but we know we can't drink seawater. Seawater it's not safe to drink. And if we look at chloride concentrations, above 250 milligrams per liter, the water tastes salty. They're infiltrating 9,300 milligrams per liter. World Health Organization has this general classification system. They use total dissolved solids. It's really easy to measure, and so you can do it very quickly, cheaply, and many samples, so they use that method. And so they say a TDS of 900 to 1,200 milligrams per liter is classified as poor quality. TDS greater than 1,200 is non-potable. Blowdown water was as high as 25,000. So this is not water that you can drink. So the January test, they put 100,000 gallons of the wastewater diluted with 300,000 gallons from their well C for a total of 400,000 gallons infiltrated. And we see is what we would expect is that this is their monitoring well and the water level in the monitoring wells. And every time they put water in, it went right down to the groundwater and we see a response. Different response at different times, primarily because they put in different volumes of water. So on this one right here, they're putting in much more water than they did in some of the others. So a really close, rapid connection between the surface and their infiltration basins and the groundwater. Okay, so then they did this test on April 9th through the 29th. And they put in a total of 600,000 gallons. And now they used a different method. They used this blended effluent method. So the power company has some ability to determine what the concentration of the blowdown water will be. They can let it sit in the system for a short period of time and the concentrations will be longer, or will be, if they leave it in the system for a short period of time, concentrations will be lower because there hasn't been enough time to generate higher concentrations. And if they leave it in longer, the concentrations will be higher. So what they did was they collected all the water from different blowdowns and they decided they would mix them together. They would blend the water to meet the requirements that the state has for those items that have requirements. And they put it in 5 separate tanks. This is where it gets really interesting. This is information right from their final report. And they define, these are their tanks, SV30, SV25. So in this case, they took SV30 and SV25 equal parts from each one. And then that's what they put into the infiltration basin. And of course, if we knew what the concentrations were in those 2 tanks, then we can calculate what the concentration they actually put in the ground was. So, and sometimes they just took one, so this is SV36, and they put in only SV36, and so on. And so they define SV30, SV25, SV36, SV27, FTS, and UST. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6. They said there were only 5, but there are 6. They report, and here's the data from their report. They give the chemistry from the 5 tanks. But wait a minute, there are 6 tanks. And these are the numbers that they're referring to, the tank IDs, and they don't go with the list that they put on the other page. SV30, do you see an SV30 there? Oh, it's SV3, well maybe SV3 is SV30. And SV36, well I don't know what that is. So you can't, I mean, because there's a tank, there's 5 versus 6. It's impossible to determine what they actually did. So we don't know what they did. And I taught my groundwater class last semester in the fall, did a class project and looking at the potential for groundwater contamination from this site. And they did all kinds of chemical manipulations to try and be able to calculate what was actually put in the ground. And it's not possible. This was the basin that they did for both of them. These are the wells that sort of shows you where this is. Here's the cooling towers on the lower right corner here. Here are the observation wells from all their different infiltration basins. And This is what it looks like on the digital elevation model. So they have some of these wells down here on the floodplain of the Chicora River. And then we have all the ones that are up associated with the actual basins. This area right here is actually a sand pit for the railroad when the railroad was active in building there. And so here I just marked on this digital elevation model, the red box for all of the infiltration basins lie within this area, right on the edge of this slope down into the Ossipee, into the Chicora River. Looking at this site in terms of whether it's a good place to try to dispose of waste or not, it's the absolute worst site in the entire area. So this is a map that was done by Mia Akuagi, who is a graduate student at the University of Vermont, worked for Green Mountain, worked with Green Mountain, and she came up with this map that looked at the areas with the greatest groundwater vulnerability to contamination in the Ossipee Watershed. This is the area of maximum vulnerability. The green dot represents where the infiltration basins were located. This is a map that we made that looks at the infiltration basins, and then what we did was we marked where we could see houses. And then, so here's the Chicora River, here's the plant right here, and we have businesses along 41. This is the Secaucus Pines, I think, development in here. And this is housing that's next to Route 16 that runs through here. This blue starred circle is the Tamworth Pines well, which is one of the private wells that are I shouldn't say that private well. It's a public water supply well that provides water to a lot of the houses in this area. And so the question that we have is, they put this 1 million gallons of waste, and where did it go? Did it go here? Did it go here? Did it go here? Where did it go? What we also did in last summer, we collected more wells, water samples. We have from Secaucus Pines, and one of these in this area right here, one of these private wells had the highest chloride concentration and sodium concentrations that we have observed in that round of sampling. So maybe the water went this way. So those were the questions that we were trying to answer. Where did this water go? And if they had put in 100,000 gallons a day, what would be the impact on the area? And I think Tara said a little bit about this. In last August, Green Mountain and this committee submitted letters in opposition to the project, and some of the figures that you see in my presentation came from that report. And so that was August 18th, and remarkably, 8 days later, ENGIE, the parent corporation of Pinetree Power, withdrew all requests for permits to discharge wastewater to the aquifers. So they pulled all their permits, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. So the question we were left with, well, where is the 1 million gallons that they put in there? Where's it going? When will it get there? What will be its chemical composition? And so the groundwater class last year looked at that, and one of our principal tools was to use a mathematical model of groundwater flow, USGS groundwater model, MODFlow, to try to answer those questions. And so here is some of the preliminary results from MODFlow. And so here you can see this is where the basin was, and then these white lines are lines showing where the contaminant moved in this model simulation. It didn't go to the north. The well that we saw in Secaucus Pines was not contaminated by the addition of the water here. We now know that for certain. And we know it for certain because one of the other tools that we used was to look at the isotopic signature of the water itself. We looked at the isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen that make up the water molecules. And one of the things that happens when you evaporate water is you change its isotopic composition dramatically. So the water that's coming through the system from the power plant will have a very distinctive isotopic signature. And we should be able to find it if we could ever get a chance to sample where it is. Now, in terms of where it's actually going down here, we really don't know. The thing about modeling is you can make it answer almost anything you want. It may come out any way you want because we don't know enough about the aquifer. And the thing that we really need to know in this case is we need to know the base flow, that meaning the low flow of the Shikara River down at, say, the Route 41 bridge. And we also need to know the flow of the Shikara River upstream of this area. And knowing those two numbers will allow us to know how much connection there is between the groundwater and the river. Because if there's a really high connection between the groundwater and the river, then all the contaminants are many of the contaminants are likely ending up in the river. It may be that some don't because the concentrations are so high that we predict that the wastewater that's put in the aquifer will sink right to the bottom of the aquifer because of its high density. And so it might move under the river and not get picked up on. But all those things we don't really know. So we don't really know whether it will impact the public supply well over here at Tamworth Pines. So that's where we are. And I think, as we think about, what is this story telling us? It's telling us we have to be extremely vigilant about protecting our aquifer. Once the aquifer is contaminated, then at least for our lifetimes and probably our children's lifetimes, the water will not be drinkable. We really, it's so easy to contaminate and so difficult to deal with once it's contaminated. We have to be extra vigilant in this area of the aquifer. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Bob, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, there are some questions that folks have sent in over the chat feature here.
Okay.
Let
me just do one thing here. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and now I can see the question. But if you read them to me, that will help.
Okay, so the first one's from Tom Gross. He says, who did the Sherlock Holmes discovery work and how was it done?
Well,
I think it was
Tara
referring
did
to all
a
your
lot
pictures.
of the work, and there were others involved, and Maureen was involved in an important way, and I'm not going to say anything about who said what after that. But there was a lot of help from people who were extremely helpful and gave us a lot of really good information about what was happening. But Tara, I think, deserves a lot of credit for this.
I don't know, Bob, some of those pictures of the rapid infiltration basins were pretty nifty. I don't know how you pulled that off, but. You
didn't, I'm not admitting to taking them,
okay.
But I'm not denying it either.
All right.
I have no comment on that.
Okay, the next question is, if this plant were in one of the neighboring towns, would their groundwater protection ordinance have prevented the discharge into the aquifer? Do other states regulate sodium and chloride discharges? And this is from Kit Morgan.
Yeah, so Kit, let me just say, nobody wants to regulate, no state wants to regulate sodium and chloride. And the reason for that is that's what we put on our roads in the winter to make them passable. So that answer is nobody does that. But I will say that I also don't believe there is any, there may be, but there may be no states that allow, no other states that allow power plant blowdown water to be disposed of on the land. That is written into many state laws. California is the one that says, well, you can put power plant blowdown water into saline lakes. So if it's a salt lake, yeah, you can put it in there, but otherwise you can't put it anywhere. It's recognized to be highly salt rich and really detrimental to all groundwaters.
The other part of Kit's question was referring to whether or not this would have happened in a neighboring town with a groundwater protection ordinance in place. Would it have been prevented? I do believe that this is one of the 12 or 13 prohibited uses that are listed in most town groundwater protection ordinances that are based on the state template ordinance. So it would not have been allowed in neighboring towns. The next question is from Mark Longley. Where is the wastewater going now? And prior to this, Mark, the wastewater was going to Plymouth, New Hampshire, for treatment there. I'm not sure post, having not done this permit or not gotten this permit, if they're redoing that same situation, have that same, solution for their blowdown water or not. There might be somebody else on this group that has more awareness of what they're doing with their wastewater at this point. But beforehand, they were going to Plymouth with it and trucking it out.
Yeah, but let's go back even further, because most of the time the plant was in operation, the wastewater was the salts and other compounds in the wastewater were removed from the water and added to the ash, and then that solid material was used to used in soils to make the soils better. And there's a lot of controversy whether it really makes it better or not, but it certainly doesn't make it worse. They did it in some agricultural soils, and there was a lot of monitoring of cows that were using feed that was grown on the fields that had that material, and there was nothing that was found in the milk or in the cow's meat. So I think that method is how it was operated for most of the time, and that seems to be a very environmentally responsible way to do it. It certainly was advanced for its time. If we go back to the time that they built this plant, they certainly were doing some really good state-of-the-art things at that time.
Okay. The next one is from Karen Vitek. Senator Bradley was helpful in getting the permit pulled. Yes, thank you for pointing that out, Karen. Yes, he did make some phone calls, and you were also instrumental, Karen, in making that all happen. Noreen says, with the rapid infiltration basins, how does the testing of the infiltration work in January? Isn't the ground frozen? Yeah,
so that's an interesting thing. And I don't know for those basins, but in general, the ground doesn't freeze very much in forested areas around here. I know it's hard to believe. Certainly if you're in any place where they plow the snow off the ground gets really frozen deep. But there's not a lot, and our soils are so dry because they're so porous and they're so coarse grained that water that's there, even if it were to freeze, would leave something that's very porous. Now you can say, well, that's true, Bob, but when they put the water in there, they saturate it. But that water that they're putting in is salt water. So it doesn't freeze, it just goes down. Mm-hmm. So I think it probably works just as well in the winter as it did in the summer. That would be my guess.
Okay.
But they didn't, there may be data in their report to support that. I don't remember that.
Okay, moving on. Tom Gross asked, Tara can describe how discovered the problem in the first place and spurred you to investigate. So I believe the issue of their first permit, the temporary permit, was brought to the attention of the OAAC shortly after the fact, by Kit possibly, or somebody else that knew of it, or Noreen, somebody who knew of it in the area. That's right. And so that was brought to our attention, and you know, we looked up on OneStop data, which is open to anyone. So you can go on there at any time and all this information is public. And while they did not have to notify abutters, they did have to submit some paperwork into the town to notify the town of their plans and intent to do the groundwater discharge. So people keeping abreast of those issues in their towns is so critical. I can't emphasize that enough. That's pretty much how it was brought to our attention. Somebody was, you know, ear to the ground in their town and found out about it. So
thank you to all for the great work.
Right. Thank you, Tom. The next one is from Mark Longley. If the two organizations were not involved, would the state have stepped in to assess the impacts?
No.
And no, right. Go ahead, Bob. You can answer that one.
I'll answer that part. Definitely no. The only concern the state had, they had two concerns. One was, will the ground accept all the water? And then they were partially concerned about the potential failure of the slope. They were so close to that rather steep slope down to the Chicago River, they were worried that if it became saturated, that whole hillside could collapse. So that was another item of concern. The state was really only concerned about arsenic as being a contaminant, and Pinetree Power felt that the arsenic was coming from lumber that was used to build the pressure treated lumber that was used to build the cooling tower. So they had agreed to rebuild it and take the arsenic treated wood out, and they thought that would solve that problem. But those are the only things the state was concerned about, was the potential for arsenic and the potential for collapse of the slope next to the Chicago River.
Okay, and then he also follows up with, might the plant be looking at substitute biocides like H2O2?
Yeah, so there's a wide range of things that are currently being used. And so peroxide is a reasonable alternative. There's actually a whole specialty industry about how biocides to use in cooling towers. So I think, yes, there were alternatives that might have helped the situation somewhat. A lot of those still have a lot of chloride in them, but because they're mixtures of other things. So I don't know. All we know is that's what they were using. The nice thing about the bleach is it's very cheap.
Okay, and then Noreen writes, the former Pinetree plant manager who lives in Madison called me because he knew about my connection with GMCD. And this is how we actually found out in the beginning about the issue there in their groundwater discharge permit, the first one. So thank you, Noreen, for clarifying that. I forgot. So yeah, a lot of people were involved in this issue and bringing it to our attention within the Ossipee Aquifer Advisory Committee. And so thank you to everyone who played a part in this, and Dr. Newton for doing all of the legwork and the research and coming up with the science to show that, you know, this was not acceptable and this was not protecting our area's drinking water. And it could potentially impact other towns. You saw the maps, all those other abutters were fairly close to where this was all happening. And so just another, you know, reiteration of the importance of having protection measures in place in your towns prior to something like this coming up. Those groundwater protection ordinances would have prohibited something like this from happening in critical recharge areas within the town. So something to look into for other towns. Hopefully this gives you some more impetus for moving forward on that measure in your town if there's not protection measures in place. As you can see, the state of New Hampshire could only protect so far, as they have regulations for some of these chemicals, but not all of them. And as you saw with Dr. Newton's slideshow, a lot of these chemicals can make our water non-potable. So, and the state has their hands tied. They can't really do anything about that at this point because some of those substances are not regulated. Let's see, it looks like we have a couple more questions here. Tom Gross says, what's the potability of the water now in this part of the Ossipee Aquifer and the whole aquifer?
Yeah, so we don't know now. We haven't sampled since this event occurred, so we don't know. That's the bottom line.
Okay. And I should say, Bob, we're planning some more follow-up testing for some of these wells that we did close by for, you know, folks that are part of Tamworth Pines and Secocas Pines, and
so I would have to say that at the current time, there'll be no sampling this summer because of COVID.
Right.
My lab is still closed, and I don't know if it'll ever be open.
Mm-hmm. Well, at some point in the future, we hope to do some follow-up testing and see what's happened, if anything, with the groundwater quality. We do have some baseline information, which is great, from the 2019 groundwater study that Bob was a big part of. So here's another question coming up. Should we propose legislation to stop this type of discharge? Well, that's a loaded question.
Well, I think the answer is yes. I mean, there's lots of legislation out there that you could use as a template to say, hey, if you've got a power plant, you don't dispose of the water, the wastewater on the ground. And you know, maybe you put it in rivers. A lot of people put it in tidal rivers where it gets out into the ocean right away. But you don't put it on the ground, because it will contaminate the groundwater. So I would say, yeah, you could do that. Hopefully, people have learned their lesson. And I think it's actually a very, I can't imagine in today's world that anyone would propose this kind of operation in the future. And even this one was quite surprising given what's known about power plants, wastewater, contamination of groundwater. It's well known, and so I just don't think it'll happen again. But maybe I'm being naive.
Okay. The next question is, would you say we've maintained a good relationship with the power plant? You know, Mark, I can't answer that. We haven't really had any relationship with the power plant. I think we had reached out to them by letter at one point to notify them of our letters going to the state and to the commissioner at DES to oppose the groundwater discharge permit, the second one. And they never reached out to us. Actually, I think that letter got returned, in fact, because it was, there's no local address that we could find for the power plant. So we don't really have a relationship at this point with the power plant. Let's see. Bob, what is your guess based on past research of current potability? From Tom
My guess is the potability is fine right now. That's my guess. I think there may be a small area where the water is not drinkable, but we can hope that that water is going into the Shikara River, and dilution is the solution to pollution, where it could be diluted out. I think that the 1 million gallons was not enough to make a regional problem. And had they done 100,000 gallons a day for a year, then you'd have a very serious problem. But they only did 1 million gallons total, spaced over a fairly long period of time, 2 different experiments. So I don't think that there's a big problem out there. I think it's that I know that Green Mountain monitors the Shikara River, and I had advocated that we sample the Shikara River on the left bank because it doesn't mix really well. So sample on the left bank and get me some water samples for isotopic analysis. And I think we would quickly point out or be able to see when it starts coming out in the river. But we can't do that right now because of the COVID situation. But as soon as we can, we should do it. I suspect that train has left the station. Water is if it went into the river, it's gone. If it's under the river, it's a plume moving in the groundwater system, and you'd want to sample all the downstream wells to see if someone's getting sucked into somebody's well. I do think the Shikara Pines well should be monitored. I don't think it's highly likely that it would be contaminated, but it's possible. So I think that there should be some monitoring of chloride levels there, which are really easy to measure. Even just doing TDS would be really easy to do, just to see if anything happens there.
Okay, we have a few more questions, Bob, and comments here. Mark Longley says, I use the Pinetree wood ash on my pastures to raise the acidic soil's pH, and it works. And he also states, California has firm environmental laws that state that dilution can't be a solution to pollution.
Well, the reality is, it always is. That's one of the basic tenets, that it may not be allowed as a method, but that's the reality. Yeah. Thank God for dilution.
And then Matt asks, in the absence of future subsidies, do we think the plant's days are numbered?
According to what they said to the legislature, that they could not operate if they didn't get the subsidy. They haven't had the subsidy for a year. I don't know whether they're really operating now or not, but I think there are still chips being delivered. So I suspect that they may be down right now, but they'll probably be up again soon. I don't know. I think it's unlikely that wood chips in general is going to last much longer. No one's going to build a new wood chip plant. It's just not economically viable. It's foolishness. You can take the same amount of money, put it in solar arrays, and you'll make much more money from that. So I think we've seen the days of wood chip plants is about over. Wood chips might be used for other fuels like home woods, wood pellet stoves and that stuff. And I know a lot of it's being shipped to Europe. That may be where all our wood chips end up going, is to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Mark says many of our biomass plants were converted from coal plants.
Yeah, that may be true. That was not true of the Tamarack Pines plant here at this location. This plant was interestingly built using cast off parts. I think the turbine was a GE built turbine. It was built in 1940 or something. And it was scrapped out of some plant in the Midwest, and then they bought it for next to nothing and put it in here and making money on it. So yeah, this plant was, I think, just an investment to try to make money, and do it in a responsible way. At the time, it was a great idea.
Okay, well, I think that's it for the questions, unless anyone has anything else they'd like to add here. We will reach out to folks with the minutes and the recording here in case you want to share it with anyone. And really tonight, the purpose was just to share what we've been up to and some updates, and to share, this example as, impetus for folks to move on with making progress in their towns to have preventative measures in place to prevent something like this from happening. So thanks, Bob, so much for sharing all of your research and your science, and partnering with Green Mountain to do all of these groundwater studies, and working with the committee. It's been invaluable. And to everyone else that has been part of this committee, thank you so much. So I would
thank Tara, who is clearly a key person to all these studies. You've done a fabulous job, and you can go through OneStop better than anyone I know.
Unfortunately, lots of practice. All right, so we're gonna sign off. Everybody, thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks for all your questions and comments. And please share this information with other folks in your town that might be interested and concerned about drinking water protection. We're gonna sign off. Thanks, everybody.